Vampire Survivors has now put out 5 different DLC over the last couple of years. I reviewed all of them for the channel and recommended that they were worth getting. Now that there are 5 of them though, the question is, are all of these DLC equal? While I still do agree that all of these DLC are worth getting, I wouldn't say that they are equal. Since there are 5 different DLCs to choose from, newcomers to the game may wonder which DLC is best to get. Personally, I'm one to do things chronologically, so you could very well do that with the DLCs. Start with Legacy of the Moonspell, then Tides of the Foscari, then Emergency Meeting, then Operation Guns, and finally Ode to Castlevania. Now, I wouldn't recommend buying them all at once necessarily, but going through the content for each and then moving to the next one. However, if you're not wanting to travel that path and are wondering what order I would recommend the DLC in personally, then this list is for you. As always, these lists are just my opinion. I'm sure that there are people who will have different thoughts on which DLCs are better than others. I also do really like and recommend all of the DLC for Vampire Survivors, but be warned that some will probably feel less exciting if you hit some of the better DLCs first. With all that said, let's get to the list. At number 5, I have Legacy of the Moonspell. In lists like this, where I like all of the entries, I always feel bad for the bottom of that list. It makes it feel like I don't really like it, but that's not really the case. I do like Legacy of the Moonspell, but something has to be at the bottom, and this is the one. In many ways, I feel like Legacy of the Moonspell is here because it was the first DLC. It's largely just more Vampire Survivors, which is great, but it just pales a little bit in comparison to the other DLCs. The map was more elaborate at the time of release, but other DLCs have taken things to another level. While I like the weapons added as well, I must admit that only a few of them are ones I use all that much. They just aren't among my personal favorite. I feel that overall, Legacy of the Moonspell will feel a bit underwhelming when compared to later DLCs, and that's why it's in the bottom slot. At number 4, I have Emergency Meeting. This was the first crossover and third overall DLC for Vampire Survivors. When I heard about this crossover with Among Us, I thought it was a very weird decision. I wondered how a social deduction game would work in a crossover with Vampire Survivors. It just seemed like a very strange combination of game types. Now, I do still feel like it's a bit of a weird decision, but I have to say they made it work. The way they utilized aspects of Among Us into the weapons was really creative and enjoyable. They also found a way to incorporate tasks into the new map as well, which was just a little detail that helped show they were taking the crossover seriously. The thing that holds this one back for me is the addition of 8 new passives, the mini crewmen. These are passives that are required to evolve the new weapons, and I feel like it just makes the whole process a bit more complicated. It really increases the pool of passives, and that can make it a bit harder to get the passive you need to evolve one of your weapons. On the positive side, when you evolve the weapon, the mini crewmen will disappear as well, freeing up your passive slot again. It's not a terrible system, but not great either. It's just not nearly as smooth as the base Vampire Survivors experience. So while I did think that the developers nailed how to incorporate Among Us into Vampire Survivors with some very creative weapons and characters that are very much from Among Us, the strange theme and passive requirements make it not get much higher than the 4th slot here. Number 3, I have Operation Guns. Now, while the bottom 2 and the top entry of this list were very easy for me to decide on, these middle 2, on the other hand, were a bit more difficult. In my mind, they are very close in quality, but Operation Guns gets the 3rd slot by just a little bit. Operation Guns is the Contra-themed DLC for Vampire Survivors and the 4th DLC released for the game. It is one of the larger DLCs for the game. I love the weapons here and the general theme of Contra with the characters and the levels. Adding guns and even more guns and some other weapons also in the mix fits the gameplay well and doesn't fall into the strange category that Emergency Meeting did, in my opinion. I also really enjoyed the boss battle that they add into the main DLC map near the end of it, which even has a bit of a side scroller kind of feel to it. It's just another way that really shows how the developers of Vampire Survivors love the games that they're crossovering with, or at least try to do it as best as they can, even if they don't love the games. It kind of shows that they really are kind of focused on some of the details of the games, and it just adds a nice little touch to the DLCs. Now, with this being a larger DLC that includes content that I really enjoyed, why is it only in the middle of the list? There are 2 main reasons, one not that significant and the other that is very significant. The first is that while I like the Neo Galuga map quite a bit, I didn't love the Hectic Highway map that came with the DLC. I'm just not a huge fan of the race style levels in Vampire Survivors. Having that as the second map just didn't really add that much much for me. Now, the bigger issue for me is again with a passive item that is required for all of the weapons of the DLC. While some lessons were learned from the Emergency Meeting DLC, Operation Guns still doesn't quite stick the landing with their passive. The weapon power-up is required for any evolution of a Contra weapon. On the positive side, this is the only passive added by the DLC, and it doesn't even take up a passive slot when you get it. However, you still need to get a number of these if you're going for a very heavy Contra weapon run. This can make it tough to get enough weapon power-ups to evolve all of your weapons, at least if you're playing on a map other than Neo Galuga. You may add lots of fun and cool weapons to get in the game, but if you can't evolve them very easily, then it kinda detracts from the experience, and that's just the way that I feel this DLC went. And it's for these two reasons that the DLC doesn't make it higher on my list. To be honest, if it wasn't for the whole passive issue, this DLC would be easily number 2. As it stands, that goes to another DLC. And that is Tides of the Foscari. Now this was the second DLC for the game, and the last, as of now, non-crossover DLC. There is nothing on the surface that makes Tides of the Foscari appear to be better than the rest of the list. It is largely on par with Legacy of the Moonspell, adding the same number of characters and weapons. This means that it has less content than both of the crossover DLCs that I've covered so far as well. While I do like the weapons added to the DLC quite a bit, it's not really what sets this DLC apart for me. The thing that struck me with this DLC is the way in which the unlocks worked. In some ways, it doesn't really function any differently than any of the other DLCs or the base game. However, as you were doing the things that you needed to do, it felt like you were kind of playing out a story while doing things on the map and unlocking new weapons or characters. And this also connected to the second map that was included in the DLC and unlocked as you progressed through some of the earlier DLC. It just felt really well done and as close to a narrative as we've had in Vampire Survivors. I feel like this is definitely a personal preference kind of thing, but I just really enjoyed the sense of progression that felt tied to the actions you took a little closer, rather than just doing random accomplishments to get something unlocked. It's a feeling that hasn't been replicated yet in any of the other DLCs, which makes Tides of the Foscari feel a little special to me. Now, if you're not one who really cares about narrative, then this one probably won't be as high on your list. As I said, the weapons are good, but I feel like there's decent weapons in pretty much all of the DLCs. So yeah, I think it's this narrative element that just kind of really resonated with me as I played through this one, which may not be the case for everyone. Number 1 is Ode to Castlevania. If you've played this DLC, you know why it is on the top of the list. While it seems silly to me now, when I heard about this DLC, I was a little worried about how it would go. Since Vampire Survivors seemed so inspired by Castlevania to start with, I was wondering how an actual crossover would go without having a lot of overlap and weapons or characters that felt too close to things that were in the base game. As it turned out, I did not have to worry about that at all. Ode to Castlevania is a huge DLC that contains more characters and weapons than all of the other DLCs combined by a good margin. And it's not like it feels like you have a lot of overlap in terms of weapons. Like, while there are whips of various types in the DLC, none of them feel like the whips that you had previously in the game. Like, it all feels very unique, very fresh, and a lot of fun. It does only have one map like some of the other DLCs, but this map is huge, and the way they deal with such a large map is really smart. Taking a page from the Contra DLC's boss battle, Ode to Castlevania contains multiple boss fights throughout the map that are activated by red summoning circles. These battles all drop chests, but they can also drop specific weapons or relics that unlock more of the castle. These gate relics also allow you to teleport to locations that are close to the boss that dropped it, but can also unlock more content from the DLC like power-ups or even new weapons. It's a really smart way to deal with a stage as large as this, and it makes you feel like you're getting farther each time you play, as you can maybe take out one or two of these bosses each playthrough. This comes close to getting the feeling of progression that the Tides of Foscari did for me, but it's not quite the same. This doesn't really feel like much of a story, but more just a gauntlet to get through. It's still tons of fun and well done, but it's not quite the same. Ode to Castlevania does have its own unique aspects that set it above the others as well, though. You see, the DLC starts with presenting only a part of the content. Once you get all of that unlocked, you will then have an event that opens up even more of the DLC to you. This was just an amazing way to throw back to some of the Castlevania games that did a similar thing in their narratives, but also a perfect way to make progression through the content feel more manageable. Granted, once everything blasts open for the second part of the DLC, it does start to get a little bit more overwhelming. Personally, I don't find it terrible. I tend to just go through things one at a time and don't tend to get too overwhelmed with things like that. But I also know that others aren't the same, and it may be a little bit overwhelming to try to figure out what to try to unlock after the second part of the DLC. DLC unlocks. Ode to Castlevania is the easy choice if you're only looking to get one DLC for Vampire Survivors. It'll give you the most content and will be very close thematically to the base game, minus a few of the extra updates like the space one. Starting here will probably make all of the other DLCs pale in comparison though, so be warned that if you start here, you may not find the earlier DLCs as worth it. That's how I would rank the DLCs for Vampire Survivors. If you're one that hasn't tried one of the DLC yet, I hope this list has helped you. If you're like me and have played all of the DLC, how close is my list to yours? Do you have a different order or do you agree with mine? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Also, I'll link all of my reviews for the various DLC in the description of the video for those who want a little bit more information about them. I hope that you enjoyed the video and I'll see you in the next one.